All right, so now we're going to talk about the structures of the respiratory portion of the lower respiratory tract. And it begins here with the respiratory bronchioles. So our terminal bronchioles eventually branch into respiratory bronchioles, and these lead into alveolar ducts and alveoli. And these are structures where gas exchange can occur. So you can get the movement of air, or gases in air, between the air-filled spaces of your respiratory bronchioles and your bloodstream, or vice versa. You know, gases in your blood can move into the air-filled space of your respiratory bronchioles, or alveolar ducts, or even alveoli. Now, these alveoli are thinly walled structures where a lot of gas exchange can occur, like oxygen and carbon dioxide can move across this membrane, and these will diffuse, like from high to low concentration, between the blood and air in these parts of the airway. So remember, we have a similar model to this in lab. So remember, we had our bronchiole. That leads into a terminal bronchiole, right, which then leads into our respiratory bronchiole, which then leads into our alveolar duct and alveoli, and all these little air sacs of the lungs are the alveoli. They're microscopically small. They're very thinly walled. They're about only half of a micrometer in diameter, and they're also surrounded by a lot of elastic tissue and capillaries. The purpose of these capillary beds is to allow for gas exchange between basically your blood and the air-filled space of your alveoli. And the purpose of this elastic tissue is to help give the lungs some elastic recoil properties. Now, in blue here, we have the pulmonary arteriole, which is going to carry deoxygenated blood to the lung. And then we get gas exchange occurring at this capillary bed, where you can pick up oxygen from your air-filled space of your alveolus, and that brings oxygenated blood back to the heart through the pulmonary venule and then pulmonary veins, which then converge back towards your heart. So if we look at this histologically, what we find is that there's a lot of wide open space under a microscope. You can see here, there's a lot of wide open spaces in lung tissue. And these open spaces are going to be things like alveolar ducts and alveoli. Now, these are part of the respiratory portion of your lower respiratory tract. So this is where gas exchange can occur. So you can actually help eliminate carbon dioxide from your bloodstream in these areas, as well as help pick up oxygen into your bloodstream from these parts of your lungs too. So remember, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli are part of the respiratory portion of your lower respiratory tract. And this is what it would look like underneath an electron microscope. You can see it's actually pretty, a lot of wide open spaces in your lung tissue. Yeah, it is kind of like spongy. In fact, if I could describe the material of the lung tissue, guys, it actually kind of feels like a sponge. And it feels a lot like a Tempur-Pedic mattress, like you push on it and it can recoil back to your resting shape. That's what your lung tissue would feel like. And so when we go to the coroner, you guys will have experience with that. You can feel, real human lung tissue. Nice. So inside your alveoli, you guys, there's 3 main types of cells. We got type 1, type 2, and macrophages. Alveolar type 1 cells are a simple squamous epithelial cell, and these are involved in gas exchange. Alveolar type 2 cells are kind of a cuboidal type of cell that produce pulmonary surfactant. And the purpose of pulmonary surfactant is to reduce surface tension in the mucus and water of your alveoli. That way their alveoli are less sticky and they're more likely to remain open or patent. And then our alveolar macrophages, also called dust cells, they remove and engulf microorganisms or debris from your alveoli. For one, they're called dust cells because if you're inhaling dust, that's removed from your airways by these cells. But macrophages have the ability to engulf and remove microorganisms or debris that might make it down in your alveolus. Now, the respiratory membrane is a very thin membrane. So remember, the respiratory membrane is going to occur in your respiratory bronchiole, alveolar, duct, and alveolus. Now, it's a very thin membrane where gas exchange can occur between air and blood. And there's an interesting property here where diffusion rate is inversely proportional to diffusion distance. We call this Fick's law. So Fick's law tells us that if your diffusion distance is longer, then diffusion rate will be lower. So it takes longer for diffusion to occur across a thicker membrane. But if your membranes are thinner, then diffusion rate is fast, and it makes sense. If you're gonna have a lot of gas exchange between blood and air, you'd want the diffusion distance to be short. That way diffusion rate is quick. So you get the really rapid exchange of carbon dioxide between your blood and air, or oxygen between air and blood, because the diffusion distance is short, diffusion rate occurs very rapidly. Now, think about some conditions that might cause this to thicken. Like if you have a thickening of your respiratory membrane from, things like asthma or other inflammatory disorders of the lung. Well, if that respiratory membrane gets thicker, then that means that your diffusion rate will be slower. It's going to be more difficult for gas exchange. This is why, sometimes inflammatory conditions of the lung can be fatal. You guys hear about people actually dying from like really severe asthma. And it's definitely possible. We usually think about it as being a benign condition, but it can lead to some pretty serious effects if it's dramatic enough. And so the reason why we want our respiratory membrane to be thin is to allow for diffusion to occur quickly. Now remember, diffusion is a passive process. So diffusion is where gases or molecules can move from an area of high concentration to low concentration, right? So imagine like the air-filled spaces of your alveoli. They're going to have a higher concentration of oxygen than the oxygen levels in your blood. So that means that due to diffusion, oxygen will flow from the air-filled space of your alveolus into your bloodstream because it's in lower concentration in the bloodstream. Or imagine like carbon dioxide levels will be higher in the blood and lower in the alveolus. So CO2 is going to move from blood into the air-filled space of your alveolus. That's just diffusion, you guys. It's a passive process. So it doesn't require any ATP to move these gases. They just move on their own accord due to the forces of nature, diffusion. So if we look at the respiratory membrane here, what we find is that each of these little circles is an alveolus, and it's in cross-section. So the alveolar membrane or wall is made of 3 cell types. We've got type 1 cells, type 2 cells, and macrophages. These are showing the type 2 cells. They're kind of a cuboidal like a cell, and they produce pulmonary surfactant. What was the function of pulmonary surfactant?
Stickiness of water.
Good. Reduce the stickiness of water. So we call that we said it reduces surface tension, right? And it makes sense. Like if the walls of the alveolus were sticky, they could potentially collapse and stick together. And you wouldn't want that because then you couldn't have proper gas exchange between air and blood because there wouldn't be really air there. So to keep this alveolus open, pulmonary surfactant, which is made by type 2 cells, reduces the cohesiveness of water molecules here and makes them less sticky and therefore keeps the alveoli open or patent. Type 1 cells we can see nearby. Type 1 cells are the ones that are involved, they're like a simple squamous type of epithelium, and they're involved with gas exchange. In fact, if you guys notice here, this is actually a blood vessel, this little red thing. So between blood and the type 1 cell, this is the respiratory membrane right here. It's very thin. It's only about half of a micrometer in diameter, so it's super thin. And we can also find nearby, you guys, are macrophages, also called dust cells. The function of the macrophage was to remove any kind of debris or infectious microorganisms out of your lungs. Now, if we zoom in on the respiratory membrane here, we look up really close right here, what we find then is that here's the air-filled space of your alveolus, here's the blood-filled space of a capillary, and what we find is there's a cell here. This is the endothelium of the capillary wall. Over here is the type 1 cell of your alveolus, and we have a basement membrane just between the two. And they're fused together, which basically means that this is the entire respiratory membrane right here. And so that gases can move from air into blood or from blood into air because this membrane is thin. We talked about that was Fick's law. And by keeping this respiratory membrane thin, it allows for gases to move very rapidly from air into blood or vice versa. And this is diffusion, so these molecules only move from high to low concentration, right? So if carbon dioxide is moving from blood into the air-filled space of your alveolus, where's the concentration of carbon dioxide lower than? You got it. It's lower than the alveolus, right? And if oxygen is moving into your bloodstream, where's the concentration of oxygen higher? In the alveolus. So the oxygen's higher concentration in the alveolus, and it's going to diffuse to an area of lower concentration in blood. You might wonder, well, why is CO2 high in blood, and why is O2 low in concentration in blood? Well, carbon dioxide is a waste product that's made by your body's cells. And so it's going to accumulate inside your body's tissues, including the bloodstream. That's why it's in higher concentration than atmospheric air inside your alveolus. And then oxygen is a nutrient used by your body's cells, and it helps with the process of making ATP in your mitochondria. But when you use oxygen, it's converted to water by your mitochondria. So when you use it, it's used up. It doesn't disappear, but you make water in the process. So that as your cells are using oxygen, then you're running out of oxygen, right? And so then that keeps oxygen levels lower in blood with respect to atmospheric air, where oxygen's higher inside the atmosphere. So it makes sense. And so here's a respiratory membrane, remember? So what's this side over here, you guys?
Blood vessel.
Blood vessel, the capillary, right? Capillary endothelium. So it's a simple squamous cell, right? Very thin. And then we also have our type 1 cell over here, also very thin. And they have a fused basement membrane. They share the same basement membrane. So it means that these cells are almost fused together. That makes our respiratory membrane, which is actually pretty amazing. And it's thin enough for gas exchange to occur rapidly. Now, what we're going to do next, you guys, is kind of get away from microscopic structures and talk about how the lungs are situated within the thoracic cavity. Now, back in A&P1, we talked about how each lung is found within a pleural cavity, which are found within the thoracic cavity. So each lung occupies a pleural cavity, right? So you have a right lung and left lung. They both occupy a pleural cavity. And what helps hold the lungs in place are the pleural membranes. Pleural membranes are serous membrane. So it's a simple squamous type of epithelium. It has a lot of lubrication type of quality to it. And the pleura, there's two main layers because it's a serous membrane. We have a visceral layer and a parietal layer. The visceral layer of pleura is what's directly on the lung itself. The parietal layer of pleura is what lines the inside of your thoracic wall. And what separates the visceral and pleural layers here is the pleural cavity. Okay? So the pleural cavity is a fluid-filled cavity between the visceral pleural and the parietal pleura, and it's filled with serous fluid, which helps lubricate the lungs. That way when the lungs are actually expanding and contracting, they're not really rubbing up against nearby tissues, right? Now, one thing that's important to note too, guys, is the visceral pleura, it anchors the lungs to the inner thoracic wall so that the lungs are actually held open and attached to the inside of your thoracic wall through that visceral pleura. If the pleura gets damaged, then it's likely that your lung can collapse because the lung has a lot of elastic tissue and its natural tendency is to recoil into kind of a shriveled-like structure, but it's held open by this pleura. Now, because the lungs are anchored to the thoracic wall by your pleura, that means your lungs change shape with the changing shape of your thoracic wall. That makes sense, right? So if you expand your thoracic cage by inhaling, take a deep breath in, and your thoracic cage expands, that means it's also pulling your lungs open, right? It's expanding your lungs as your thoracic cage expands. Or if you just relax and exhale, and your thoracic cage contracts, then your lungs also contract with that. So that means that the pleura help influence the state of the lungs because they're anchored. They're together, right? Their thoracic cage moves, the lungs move, as long as those pleura are intact. So what does this look like? Well, this is showing as if you could cut away the anterior thoracic wall. Here's our lung itself, right? So you got our right lung, which has 3 lobes. What's the layer of tissue that directly surrounds the lung? Visceral pleura, good. And then what lines the inner thoracic wall? Parietal pleura. And there's a space between the two, right? Pleural cavity, good. In fact, if we zoom in on this, we can see it over here. So here's our here's our parietal pleura. Here's our visceral pleura. And the space between the two is the pleural cavity, which is a fluid-filled cavity and filled with serous fluid, and it helps lubricate the lungs. Now, one of the other functions of the pleura is to also hold your lungs open. Because if this pleura were damaged or non-existent, your lungs would actually shrivel up and recoil towards the bronchi. They wouldn't occupy the entire thoracic space there, right? Or the pleural space. The natural tendency of your lung, because of its elastic tissue, is to actually recoil to a very small, shriveled up kind of structure. Okay. Now, the lungs are held open by the pleura. So that's important to note. And what this means too is that because the pleura anchored the lungs to the thoracic wall, if you change the volume of your thoracic wall or cage, then that's also going to change the volume of your lungs. So keep that in mind. Now, in terms of other gross anatomy of the lung, we have a base, which is the inferior part of the lung, and the apex, which is the superior part. We have a costal surface, which is what is right by your ribs, and a mediastinal surface, which is by your mediastinal cavity or your heart. And if you look at this, you guys, here's the apex, which is the superior point of your lung. Here's the base, which is the inferior large part. Your right lung has 3 lobes. So you have the upper, middle, lower, or superior, middle, inferior lobes. The superior and middle lobe are separated by a horizontal fissure, whereas the middle and inferior lobe are separated by an oblique fissure. And this surface is the costal surface, which is right by your ribs. That's important to note because if someone has a rib fracture, depending on where the fracture is, if it protrudes inward, it's possible that their fractured rib could puncture their own lung, right? Because fractured ribs are pretty sharp, just the way that bones break. And it's likely to get the costal surface of the lung here kind of more externally or laterally. Now, on the medial aspect of the lung, what we find is the mediastinal surface, which is right by your heart or mediastinum, right? And the left lung only has 2 lobes. We have a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. Because the heart kind of protrudes to the left, there's not a lot of room for a third lobe there. And there's actually a cardiac notch, which actually is a big space in the superior lobe of the left lung that accommodates the left ventricle of your heart. In fact, it's not, actually it is shown here. Do you guys see this little thing called the lingula? Lingula means little tongue. So lingula is this little tongue-like structure on the superior lobe of the left lung, and it's basically like a middle lobe that never really developed. Now, this picture doesn't show it being very prominent, but sometimes this lingula, you guys, actually hangs down pretty far like a tongue. It's like a dog's tongue. It just kind of like dangles there. This picture doesn't show it being very prominent, but sometimes you can see it. Just this huge tongue-like structure hanging off the superior lobe of your left lung. It's called the lingula. So it's like a middle lobe that never really developed into a middle lobe. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, lung tongues, exactly. The lingula. Bless you. Now, looking at a medial view of the lungs, you guys can see the mediastinal surface. This also has the hilum. So our hilum is the place in the lung where all the vessels enter or exit the lung. If it's blue, what does that mean? Deoxygenated. So this is an artery, pulmonary artery. And if it's red, oxygenated. And this is the pulmonary vein. Good. And then this structure here, you guys, is the main bronchus. Makes sense. This is what would link up with the trachea nearby. Now, the lung has what we call bronchopulmonary segments, which there's about 8 to 10 of these in the left lung. Thank you. And these bronchopulmonary segments are the parts of each lung that are served by a specific tertiary bronchi or segmental bronchi. Okay? And each segment here is supplied by its own tertiary bronchus. And it has its own pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, and bless you. And each bronchopulmonary segment is surrounded by its own connective tissue. So what this means is that the bronchopulmonary segment is like basically its own little structure in the lung. This is clinically significant because if someone has a cancer or a tumor in a specific bronchopulmonary segment, then you can just remove that segment without affecting nearby structures because it's completely separate from the rest of the lung. It has its own airway, it has its own blood supply and blood drainage, which means if you take out a specific bronchopulmonary segment, you're not going to affect nearby structures. Like you're not going to have a hole opening up into another segment. If you remove, let's say like an inferior bronchopulmonary segment, then you can just remove that part of the lung. So let's check this out, you guys. So what this is showing is actually the specific bronchopulmonary segments of your lungs. And they're anatomically distinct because there's connective tissues that separate all of these. They're also functionally distinct because each bronchopulmonary segment gets its own tertiary bronchus as well as its own pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein. So they're actually all separate parts. And so you guys don't have to identify this anatomically, what these are, but it's just important to note clinically how these exist because what if someone had a cancer on the sort of the inferior part of their right lung here? Well, you can remove the entire bronchopulmonary segment without affecting other lung structures because they're actually separated even by connective tissues. It's kind of weird, you guys. I know it looks like one big together lung, but there's actually connective tissues that separate each of these little color-coded regions. So it means that these actually don't communicate. I know they're side by side, but there's no airways that would cross from either side. It means that all the airways in this segment are their own separate airways, and they don't interconnect with other nearby bronchopulmonary segments. Same with the blood supply. So it's kind of interesting. That's what keeps them separate. Now, in terms of the blood supply to your lungs, you guys, there's actually 2 types of blood supply. We got pulmonary circulation and bronchial circulation. Back with the heart, we learned about how the pulmonary artery, or arteries, bring deoxygenated blood to the lungs, And the pulmonary veins bring oxygenated blood back to the heart, specifically the left atrium. And that's part of your pulmonary circulation. So it's a part of your pulmonary circulation where, or blood flow between the heart and lungs, right? Now that differs from bronchial circulation because back in blood vessels we learned about how those bronchial arteries that are branches of the thoracic aorta, those bronchial arteries come straight off of the aorta and they bring oxygenated blood to the lung tissue itself. I know it sounds kind of weird because you think about the heart as pumping blood to the lungs and helping to bring deoxygenated blood to the lungs, but how do other lung tissues receive their oxygenated blood if they're not participating in gas exchange? Like other parts of the conducting system of your lower respiratory tract get their blood supply from bronchial circulation. It's part of your systemic circulation, not pulmonary, it's systemic, because there are branches of the thoracic aorta that come right off the aorta and they bring oxygenated blood to the lungs itself. Now, there's also a lot of lymphatic drainage in the lungs. We learned about this back in the lymphatic system because the lungs receive a tremendous amount of blood flow. And because they have a lot of blood flow and a lot of capillaries, there's also the potential for infection and fluid accumulation due to leakage of capillaries, due to bulk flow. So what we need today are a lot of lymphatic vessels to pick up that excess fluid and carry that excess fluid back towards your blood system, right? And what we see here then, all this in green are lymphatic vessels, and these lymphatic vessels drain lymph away from lungs. There's a lot of lymph nodes associated with your lungs too because there's the potential for infection because there's a lot of exposed space in your lungs. All of these lymphatic vessels eventually drain into our bronchiomediastinal trunks, which then connect with the right lymphatic duct and thoracic duct directly. And so there's a tremendous amount of lymph drainage from lungs. And it would make sense too because you don't want a lot of fluid to accumulate inside your lung tissue because that fluid can start to block your airways and you can basically start to suffocate on your own tissue fluid. And so to avoid that, we need a tremendous amount of lymphatic drainage from our lung tissue.